Hello, and welcome to episode 367 of the Crate and Crowbar. Joining me, Chris Thurston, in the waning hours of the 30th of April 2021 are Marsh Davis.
Hello.
And Graham Smith.
Hello.
Hello, both. Marsh.
Yes.
I'd like to enter into a kind of pact with you now.
Okay.
If you will. In exchange for letting you plug your shit, I'd like you to explain the gaming news to me. But we can start with the shameless self-promotion if you like.
You drive a hard bargain, but it is a bargain that I will take. A pact with an occult master does seem to be particularly suiting, given the topic that I shall now discuss. I'd like to plug my most recently released pen and paper one-shot, if I may. I can't even remember how long ago it was now, but we, as in we being a friend of pod, Jim Rossignol and I, released a role-playing one-shot. Was it 2 months? Was it a month? Who knows? Back called Night of the Hogman, with the intention of releasing 3 of these things, and then a full-sized role-playing setting called Teeth, which is set in a cursed corner of 18th century England. And this is the second of those intended releases, and it is called Blood Cotillion, and it's about attending a society ball in 1775 specifically, and then doing a series of fucking horrible murders as you try to extract information from cultists who are hosting the ball. And everybody plays young ladies in fabulous dresses who must appear like they are there to secure the prospect of a husband, but are in fact a band of deadly, well-blooded assassins tasked with locating and destroying the Blood Shrine, which is, which is there, and is reputed to have corrupted the family who are throwing the ball. And so you sort of have to partake of the festivities and sneak about this manor and glean information about these horrible brothers who make up the family. And then you sort of beguile them with your wit and talent and dancing and cards, and then properly fuck them up, and ideally without being discovered and murdered yourselves. It's quite good fun. We did play tests with Alex and our regular role-playing group, and there were bodies being stuffed into walls. There was opium abuse. There was arson. Somebody got blown apart by a cursed rifle misfiring. It was really good. Yeah. Anyway, it's you can buy it for $7 from teethrpg.itch.io, and there's like 45 fat pages of detailed, illustrated ballroom occult horror, and you can also get Night of the Hogman for free from the same place as well.
Lovely. You've done some lovely sketching and scratching on this. I have enjoyed your etchings and woodcut type Hogman.
Yes. This one has far more illustrations, and I've paid for it because I sit in a broken chair in a cramped position, and now my back no longer functions as a normally pliable and bendable part of my body.
Just stiff as a rod, and that's the guarantee.
Neat.
Well, we did make a bargain at the beginning of this episode, Marsh, and it was that in return for the marketing that you've just performed, worthy as it might have been, you will explain to me what's happening.
There's 2 things happening, Chris. Only 2 things happening.
Thank God.
One's maybe bad, but inevitable, and the other one, I don't know, but you'll tell me. The one I don't know about is Wolfire Games, who made a game called Overgrowth. I don't know if you remember that. It's been out for ages. Had sort of acrobatic,
like the rabbit combat.
Rabbits. Yeah, really ninja rabbits fucking each other up. I don't know anything more about it than that. I think I did play it at one point. Anyway, they've launched an antitrust suit against Steam on Valve, and this is in the same week that Microsoft announced that the Microsoft Store will be reducing its cut from its store takings from 30 to 12%. I think is that the same as what Epic has? I can't remember.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And Wolfire's case is partly about the what they see as an extortionate cut being taken by Valve, but it also seems like the main bone of contention is this policy called the Steam key price parity provision. Just really trips for the tongue. Which, as I understand it, you may have to correct me here, Graham, but this is a policy which ensures that you can't sell Steam keys for your game any cheaper anywhere else. So, or rather, you can, but you must be prepared to then offer a similar discount to Steam customers within a reasonable time frame. And that sort of includes like off Steam bundles. So you can have a bundle, but then you have to offer the game at an equivalent discount on Steam at some point. But I don't think this means, and I feel like Wolfire's wording in the articles I've read sort of doesn't really get to this, maybe sort of intentionally. I don't think it means that you can't sell the game for less anywhere. It just means you can't sell Steam keys for the game elsewhere. So I think if you wanted to sell a standalone executable of your game which doesn't interface with Steam at all, you could do that at any price point you wanted. And that doesn't seem like wildly unreasonable to me on paper, but I suppose like Steam's existing monopoly does sort of change that in practice, because like currently their dominance is such that selling something without a redeemable Steam key does feel sort of like abnormally inconvenient because of their monopoly.
Yeah.
But tell me what you think and what this means.
Well, I'm pretty sure I don't. I don't like. So
it's the opening of the hot take trapdoor. Who's inside?
So Steam key price parity provision certainly makes it sound as if it's just about the Steam keys, but I'm pretty sure that Epic have said that that Steam or Valve basically mandate that any discount you offer on your game anywhere else, you've got to offer equivalent on Steam. So I don't know if the name there is maybe misleading, but I've certainly heard reports of that in the past. Am I right in thinking that Wolfire, the founders of Wolfire, they're also the founders of Humble, right?
Yes.
Okay, because I mean, it's slightly odd to me that it's Wolfire bringing this suit. I mean, I guess they're the company that sells games through Steam, but it's the same people that also own a whole ass store that sells Steam keys. Like, that's their entire market. And in fact, they just changed the split that they offer to publishers and developers. So I don't know if you guys discussed this on last week's podcast or not.
No, I don't think so.
Humble Bundle has always offered sliders that allowed people to set how much money went to the publisher and developer of a game, how much money went to Humble themselves, and how much went to a charity. And there were no caps on how you could move those sliders around. So you could actually say that Humble should get no money and charity should get a huge, huge chunk. You now can't do that. They've removed the sliders and replaced it with just two fixed options to give either 5 or 15% to charity. But as part of that, the default position for publishers and developers has gone from 60% to an 80% cut. And if you increase the cut you give to charity, increased it to 85% by default for developers and publishers. And if you increase the amount you give to charity from 5% to 15%, then it takes 5% away from Humble. So their cut goes from 10% to 5% and 5% away from the publisher. So they go from 85 to 80. So they're obviously, moving towards parity with Epic and what the Microsoft Store have just done as well, leaving Steam as another outlier. But I mean, I would see this class action lawsuit as connected to that, and not just the people that made the Rabbit Kung Fu game 6 years ago. Yeah.
So I think Humble was initially started by Wolfire, but I don't know what connection they have with it now.
It
Like,
got bought by IGN in, I think, 2017.
yes, exactly.
But the two founders hung around, and as far as I know, they're still there. As far as I know, they're the CEO and like the CTO or something like that of Humble.
Okay, so yeah, definitely still with a somewhat of a vested interest. So do you think this this sort of news story emerged from them wanting to give another platform as bad a news week as they had previously?
I would imagine that this has been in the works for a long while. Dealing with lawyers and all that sort of stuff, putting together a case like this takes a bit of time. But it does seem like the wagons are circling around app stores with a bit of a monopoly, because at the same time, just earlier today, there's been advances in Spotify's case against Apple over the App Store and cuts and limitations that Apple put on Spotify as a business. And next week is when Epic's case against Apple begins in court. And that's going to have ramifications for Steam, because if they pass a bunch of laws that say that Apple can't do what Apple are doing, probably Steam can't do what Steam are doing as well. But I do think it's a more complicated case than sometimes gets talked about, because although Valve's 30% cut is larger than the 12% taken by other stores, Steam is also a much better store with with a lot better tools for developers and a lot more customers. But at the same time, it's hard to, like, if Valve are stopping developers being able to offer sales of their game on other stores, and thus essentially preventing Epic, for example, or Humble from being able to compete on price, then it is surely anti-competitive. And it's certainly worse for customers. Like, I want to live in a situation where Epic are trying to undercut the price of Steam games, but right now that can't happen, and so Epic compete instead by like exclusives and guaranteed minimums for developers.
This is the thing, right? This whole situation, as with the Epic and Apple thing previously, it has a big whiff of Godzilla versus Kong to it. You know what I mean? Like, there's always going to be an element of like, well, when our hero King Kong smashes Godzilla in the face with a bus, that was still somebody's bus, even if we're cheering. That's a bad analogy. But to put a finer point on it, this particular example about Steam keys is kind of an interesting one, because I can kind of understand when they would latch onto this. I don't know enough about the situation of Graham. It seems like you were saying that it seems like two things are getting melded together here. One is the kind of provision against people selling Steam keys specifically cheaper elsewhere than they are through Steam itself, and the other is against games being available more cheaply on platforms other than Steam that are also on Steam. Those seems like separate things. And in the former case, I believe that on paper, at least, there is a case to be made for that policy. The thing that you're getting when you distribute your game via a Steam key is convenience and Steam's distribution services, basically. Convenience both for you and the player, and equally, their kind of CDN costs and the rest of it. And that's very much not nothing.
But do you think the value of that is distorted by Steam's monopoly position? Right.
Yes, it is. But that's when it becomes very complicated, because I don't. This is what I find is a difficult question in this. I don't believe any company should necessarily have a monopoly. However, the reason these monopolies form is because of the convenience they have offered to players over the years, and it was not exactly a fair race. We're going to get into some pretty, deep problems with competition driven technology and as it relates to the marketplace and so on. But Steam's position is because of a service it provides to players, and the tension, this tension, I think, will always exist. Maybe it will simply always exist. Maybe there's no but in that sentence, because I'm not sure how you meaningfully break down that monopoly without making it harder and more confusing to find games to play and collections to build in a digital sense, at least.
Right. Yeah.
And that will inevitably divide and demoralize gaming communities, and probably that will also be shit for developers. It's one of the reasons I think this is a bad situation. It's not just because the mega corporations are at it again and they're going at each other. It's because whichever one wins, that's not great. It's not like we want to swap out one monopoly for another. But also, there are tremendous downsides, apparently, for everybody in both monopolistic and completely divided situations. And I'm not sure what I'm not really sure what a kind of ideal middle ground looks like, short of like public ownership of Steam, you know, in the gamer nation of 2055 or something, right? Like it's sort of like it's turns out power structures that are encoded into the way people get to sell their art fucking complicated, isn't it?
It does come a point with these companies, especially, Steam often offer so much middleware for developers that gets baked into games, into the multiplayer servers and matchmaking and all this sort of stuff, that they become almost like a utilities company. So you can, it starts to feel like, well, this should be publicly owned.
Right, exactly. Like it's, it becomes that these lines get so blurry. But we depend so much on private ownership of the networks that are used to achieve almost anything, whether that's distribution of a game, whether that's marketing of games. And these things are functionally, as you say, utilities at this point. If you were a games marketer, Twitter is functionally a utility, as is Instagram and Snapchat and all of the others. And the way that these and companies that have achieved that inevitably achieve monopolies, but breaking down those monopolies inevitably then has costs for the companies that exist because of that. And I think the question here is like, I don't know. I feel like I'm threading one of my lamentable centrist kind of lines here. Apart from the fact that I don't necessarily see a tremendously positive way through this, like that preserves the ability for smaller and upcoming developers to find audiences and make money, which is something that Steam has always done, but through a series of increasingly, complex and caveated kind of entry points, is something that Epic now offers in a very different way. I don't really see a kind of maybe the positive is that these lawsuits that pick up on particular points are the force by which not necessarily monopolies are broken down, but policies are forced to become more pliable. And that I can see being a good thing, because you're absolutely right that while it makes sense on paper that Valve get to control, the terms by which people access their content distribution, it's also the case that has a very different context in Monopoly, and maybe that's a situation where we don't pursue, public ownership, but the courts are the means by which the public gets to exert some kind of will on these kind of monopolies that are increasingly dependent on. I suspect the same would be the case for social media.
Yep. I like the way you described yourself as a centrist there, but you did also suggest that the solution is to nationalize King Kong.
Right. Nationalize both of them, honestly. Both, by which I mean Godzilla and Kong.
Of course. Which one of Epic and Steam is King Kong or Godzilla?
I think Steam is Godzilla.
Yeah. More of an ancient enemy, right?
Right, but also a kind of
unknowable,
sort of more of a force, taller force of nature.
Whereas Epic does have the kind of the monkeyish, plucky brawler aspect.
I can imagine King Kong doing a Fortnite dance. I don't know. I haven't seen the film, I hasten to add.
Would you like to know the other news?
Yeah.
Official PlayStation magazine. Official PlayStation. I couldn't say the words. Official PlayStation magazine has printed its last issue. Magazine will continue to exist, but it'll be rebranded as Play, which was actually an old magazine that Future Publishing used to publish, but then retired. But it basically means that they're keeping the magazine, but they're making it not official anymore, which means there are no officially licensed console magazines now available for the first time in 32 years. It's the end of an era.
It is the end of an era.
What does it mean?
Oh, well, it means the era's ended.
Oh,
He says, looking at the era, this one's fucked.
it's gone. It's gone off.
It has, it's ended. It's ended because of changing audience interests and market forces. You're going to have to get a new one.
But will they? Do you see a future for an official, I don't know, media outlet related to a single console?
Yeah.
Yeah, but not in print.
No, it'll be on YouTube because that's where it literally is, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, PlayStation Access is one of the biggest YouTube channels, detection platform going. And I'm not just saying that because I'm friends with them. It's
I
true.
hope you continue this entire podcast in this voice.
I'm just a distant man who's repaired your boiler. I think I'll deliver all my future kind of like middle ground takes in that way, actually.
You sounded a little bit Peter Hanrahan.
I've lost the official title. I'm glad that they're just sort of refocusing it as a different magazine. That's fine. Magazine closures have the kind of whiff of inevitability about them a lot of the time, but you want that talent to find new outlets, obviously. But yeah, official mags do just feel like an artifact of a different era now. I can't imagine the conversation anymore in which they are really justified to those platform holders necessarily. Can you?
No. Did either of you used to read official PlayStation magazine? Was it ever a magazine you were a fan of?
I mean, I read it when I was in the Future Publishing offices, but I didn't have a PlayStation prior to that. I lived in a household with a PlayStation, but I wasn't a PlayStation player particularly, so I never picked up the magazine.
That PlayStation never washed up the dishes, always
Exactly.
leaving it on the side.
That felt very much like but I never inhaled type of your relationship with PlayStation.
Never inhaled Tekken, the obscene amounts of Tekken that were being imbibed via that PlayStation.
I got it on and off as a kid, and then obviously read it when we were in the office with them. Yeah, good mag, OPM. I mean, this is the thing, right? Like, there's such a kind of intermingled family of mags that there's obviously deep connections there, but it did feel like I think there are a few magazines maybe generally have deep roots in the way things were in games media an era ago, at least one era ago actually. But official mags particularly, I think like if they do feel like an artifact of a different time in the way that games are thought of, and not just in terms of console exclusivity and the kind of platform wars becoming less and less relevant, but I'm not sure that that official stamp even carries meaning in the way that it would have done a long time ago. By which I mean the 90s and noughties. Like, to what extent does any audience now care about the officialness of the information they get about games from the internet or from content creators of any kind, right? Like, it's just not. It probably, the word exclusive has probably retained its meaning, but the other great beloved cover hit of the 90s, official, probably has lost its value, I would say.
Well, it sort of made sense when it was differentiating you from other unofficial PlayStation magazines. But now there aren't any. Like, I imagine the OPM is probably the last PlayStation mag of any kind on shelves. And so at that point, you may as well not be paying Sony a bunch of money for the license. Like, even if the mag is still profitable, you'll probably retain all those sales without it and not have to pay Sony anymore. So...
yeah, I think the point and the broader point I'm trying to spin out, I guess, is that like I think that notion of like voice of truth, monolithic brand games journalism is also slowly kind of being, for years now, for the span of my entire career, pretty much has been steadily eroded by personality driven kind of personal brands of creators and content creators and particular reviewers and so on, right? Like, I don't think anyone's looking for the official word on new Tekken anymore. They're looking for their favorite fighting game influencer's opinion on it.
Yeah, or I guess the the first parties have gone to individuals. I guess Microsoft have. I mean, they've still got Major Nelson or whatever his name is, but they also work with specific individual YouTubers. That guy Benny, I think his name is, that used to be on Xbox On, for example, who has just become like the face of Microsoft for a bunch of other YouTube stuff, and like credibility is nestled in him as the kind of like official
Right.
spokesperson, but he's an individual rather than, as you say, a totemic brand.
Yeah.
What have you been playing, Graham?
I've been playing Yedoma Globula, which is a game.
How dare you?
This is a game that's on itch. It's pick what you want, and it is a first-person open-world game about exploring an infinite fractal world.
Ooh.
And it's really cool. It's been in development for years, but it feels quite early in terms of the things in this world that are interactive about it. Because basically, you're spawned into an area. You've got a little flying tugboat nearby, which is like all made out of rusted metal, and it makes a happy little chug noise as you fly through these absolutely enormous caverns where all the geometry is fractal, and that's pretty much it. You're just pottering about, basically exploring, moving between. It's got a few different tools, so you'll get on your tugboat. You'll be flying around. You'll see a shape in the distance, and it'll be pitch black. And you've got a little flare gun, and you'll think, "Oh, I'm going to fire my flare gun on that," so it lights up. You'll fire a flare, and your flare will trail off into the darkness, and then just drop off into an abyss and not light anything up, because actually the thing that you were trying to light up is so far away you can't actually hit it with your flare. Like the spaces in this game are so large that you lose all sense of perspective and during points of it, because you have nothing to base your sense of scale against as you're traveling across these distances.
Is that good or bad?
It's good. It's really cool. Like it's never so far between points that you feel like it's taking too long to get to the next point of interest. But there is something extremely atmospheric and unsettling about being in these huge spaces. And the flare gun is one of the tools you've got for exploring it. You've also got a pickaxe, which helps you lift yourself up vertical surfaces. You've got a radar device that gives you kind of like an X-ray scan of the area around you. You've got a little TV screen that lets you see into an alternate dimension. And then there's a teleport button on your boat that will switch you and your boat to that alternate dimension. And so as you're moving in one dimension, you're also moving in the other space at the same time. And so being able to like view the alternate dimension lets you check that you're not about to teleport into the middle of a wall or something like that when you switch over. And that's another way in which the game kind of make sure that you're never that far away from a point of interest, because although you might be in the middle of nowhere in one dimension, you can often check the other dimension and find that actually you're in a really interesting position in that one. And it's these kind of like, it's using different fractal algorithms for different parts of these worlds. Like if you look at it on the 3D map, it sort of looks like there's 6 different spheres, which are planetary sized or moon sized, let's say, and each one of them seems to be using a different type of fractal math, and so you get very different shapes. And so there was one world I was exploring which was like it had been designed by Geiger, or I don't actually know if that's how you pronounce his name, but it's like very spinal, like every surface was just covered in ribs and ribs at infinitely descending sizes and infinitely increasing sizes. And then there'll be like another world where everything is, I mean, I guess this is where globula comes from, but everything is made out of balls. And the balls all have a kind of like fleshy texture on them, as if they're balloons made out of skin. And it's extremely gross. But then you've got like, you'll find like little gaps in the geometry you can't quite fit through. So one of the other tools you've got is just like an explosive weapon that blows a little hole, but then the hole will close shut after a few seconds. So what you can do is you can like tunnel through obstacles a little ways in order to get yourself past things, but then watch the fleshy balloons go and kind of close shut, and that's extremely unsettling when you're also dealing with worlds that are absolutely vast, and it's really compelling just exploring these spaces. And like I said, it is quite early on, so I think there are plans that there will be like some narrative or mystery that you're uncovering as you go through the space. Right now, there are radio towers and a little device you can use for detecting them. I've flown to some of the radio towers and I can't seem to work out what to do with them, if anything. I'm not sure if it is possible to do anything with them at this stage. But it's just really fun as an exploration game. And it's stunning to look at. Like, I can't claim to understand anything to do with 3D rendering, but it's not being rendered with polygons or with voxels, which are really like the only two things that I've heard of. It's well, I'll read this from its itch.io page. Fractals are defined by signed distance functions and rendering using hierarchical cone marching. So there, yeah, that's why it's able to have so much detail and such an enormous draw distance on screen. And it's like they say that like things in the environment which are man-made, like your tugboat or like some platforms and stuff like that, or the radio towers, those are made out of polygons. But the actual fractal geometry is not being rendered with polygons, and so it's way higher detail, I feel like, than you would be able to show on screen at once, especially when it's being dynamically lit to some extent, at least. Like there are these light sources in the environment, which are incredibly bright at a distance, like almost like suns beaming through little cracks in the environment. And that's often like you'll decide, I'm going to go fly towards that green light. But the flares, you'll be dropped in an environment which is completely dark, and you'll have to use the flares to light it up. And when there is no flat surface in this enormous cavern, and every surface is just covered in these little greebles of the different sizes, and then it lights up as the flare passes across it. It feels like you're in this terrifying alien spaceship and something is about to stab you through the chest, but also it just looks incredible. So yeah, play Yedoma Globula. Like I say, it's pay what you want on itch, and it is a good time.
That sounds crazy. I don't understand really what you've described.
So, Graham, for the sake of people Googling this and not looking at the show notes, how do you spell that?
Yedoma space, and then globula is Globula.
That is a name.
So are there kind of like human structures within this otherwise procedurally generated space?
Well, that's like the radio towers and a few platforms at the start that you know, there's like a little pier almost. I mean, there's no water, it's in midair, but there's a little pier that you walk to the end of to hop on board your tugboat. And then other than that, no, not really. Everything else after that point that I've seen has just been fractal geometry. And so you will potter about in your little boat and you'll just see some interesting little cavern or some interesting space, and you will park your little tugboat and you get out and you go tunneling and exploring, and then come back to your tugboat and realize that you've parked it in a dumb place, and now it's difficult to jet back on board. You've got like a little device that lets you place your own platforms, so you can make very simple paths to help you get back on board and stuff like that. So you can put down your own man-made stuff. But broadly, no, it's just the fractal environments.
How much of those you're talking about, the kind of the gloopy, fleshy aesthetic? I mean, is that? Do you feel like there's the hand of a designer there, or is that just procedural magic being fortuitous in the way it depicts his stuff?
There's definitely a hand of a designer there. Like I would say, because there are these like 6 or 7 different environment types, I feel like a lot of effort has gone into making those interesting and distinct. Now, I don't know how you go about designing that. I'm guessing you're looking at a mathematical formula, tweaking a number, and then running it and seeing what you get out the other end, which is what a lot of procedural design is. But it's definitely gone through that process. Like, it's not just a randomized world that you're getting with no rhyme or reason to it. And then these spherical worlds are spaced out in such a way that there's a kind of like a pretty decent pacing, I would say, between finding an environment which seems completely alien, spending a decent amount of time exploring it, and then being able to have like a couple of minutes sailing to the next location as well. Like, it feels like there is thought that's going into the design of how you navigate these spaces and keep it interesting. And it's again and again like created these situations where I've sailed through total darkness towards a very distant shape that I can only see in silhouette, and then come across it and be wowed basically by essentially what comes out of the darkness as I fire my flare and see these incredible arches, like you're looking at the rings of Saturn or something like that. Does Saturn have rings?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. Like one of the lowest hanging podcast voices I think we've had to do.
It's a hard game to describe though, because I feel like I just go look at a screenshot of it. And so, like, Marsh, if you haven't already Googled it and looked at a screenshot of it, go do that now.
I've just done that, and you're right, it is hard to describe. I find, having now looked at it, I was like, oh fuck, I've got to play this. It's got like, I think it doesn't sound like it plays anything like Outer Wilds, but it seems like I didn't realize how kind of it would have that vibe. I think that same sort of sense of like alien space based on kind of maybe more like artistic logic than physical logic.
Yeah, I haven't played enough of Outer Wilds to make that comparison, but yeah, that's the sort of, in my head, it's like Outer Wilds.
Yeah, it looks rad. It looks really
beautiful. Looks fucking incredible.
See, I can't, I'm not, should have sent a poet and all that. I can't describe these spaces articulately enough to convey them, but a screenshot does the job for you, basically.
Wow. So what's the difference between the two alternate realities that you're in?
I don't.
Are they just basically?
No. There is some. I don't know if this is like, oh, we just haven't made that thing yet that explains what this is, or if it's like this is like the central mystery of the game of like what is the space and why are there two alternate dimensions and how are they connected and this sort of stuff. Like, I don't know yet. Certainly, I haven't I haven't noticed any congruent theme between like, well, this is the dimension where everything looks like shrimp, and this other dimension's the one that everything looks like hamburgers. I haven't noticed anything like that. Like, they could well just be teleporting me between. Might not even be alternate dimensions. It could just be two different points in the same universe. I don't think it is from looking at the map. But again, maybe the map's just not finished. So it's hard to tell where the edges of this experience are.
What's the device which is a cube with the London Underground logo stuck on top of it?
I'm not sure what you're looking at.
It has -82 written on the cube.
All right, that's the oh yes, I see. That's the device for detecting the radio towers. So the number changes as you turn and look around, and as you point it at a radio tower, a circle will appear in the environment and start to like pulse and beep, and it lets you know, hey, there's a radio tower in that direction. It might be extremely far away. I think that's what the number is telling you, is what distance from it are you. And then by pointing it, it tells you what direction to go.
This looks amazing.
Yeah, he wrote a pretty good post in 2018, which is linked from the itch.io page, and we'll put it in the show notes, where he explains the technology that underpins this and like how he got into developing it. He didn't know C++ when he started making this, but he had to teach himself to it at a certain point when he started trying to like, how do you take fractal geometry and write a physics system that can interact with it and all this sort of stuff, and challenges of making the lighting model that can actually reflect and bounce off this kind of geometry. It's really interesting, and it's written in layman's terms enough that I could understand it, despite being a total moron. And you could also go read Edwin Evans Thirlwell's article on rockpapershotgun.com, because he wrote a story about this for us a couple of weeks ago, which is what prompted me to play it in the first place.
I'm afraid in return for that shameless plug, Graham, you'll have to provide one news story.
Damn. Let me browse the internet for a news story that's not horrible. Have you heard the story about the Apex Legends cheater, which has been taunting and terrorizing streamers and pros? I'm not actually reading this off screen. This is just off the top of my head. But there's an Apex Legends cheater who is able to hack into people's games, including their voice chat, and is specifically targeting public people who play the game in order to like taunt them, and then use aimbots and stuff like that to destroy them during their streams. They can't do anything about it. They think this person has been banned like dozens of times, but keeps coming back, finding ways around Respawn's anti-cheat stuff. It's an obvious terrible dick that's doing this stuff, but it's becoming like a kind of boogeyman figure.
Oh wow!
For the way that he just keeps popping up during Twitch streams and stuff like that.
Sounds like Apex Legends haunted, mate. Got to start the whole thing over. Sorry. Go back to Titanfall 2. Do it again.
A typical centrist opinion from Peter Hanrahan there.
What have you been playing, Marsh?
I've been playing two games that I think are sort of interesting in their own right, but like fall really short of the experience that their premises suggest in a slightly frustrating way. The first is The Flower Collectors, which I spotted on Andy Kelly's list of the best detective games for which is on PC Gamer. And it's got just one of the most immediately enticing concepts I think I've heard in ages, which is that it's basically Rear Window, the game, except it's set in 1970s Barcelona, a few years after Franco's death, when and sort of the whole country is waking up from this fascist autocracy and slowly moving towards democracy. And you play as a guy called Jorge, apologies to all Spaniards, who is a former cop with said fascist regime. So not necessarily an immediately sympathetic figure. And he has been left wheelchair bound by an unspecified event, and now sort of spends his time grumpily peering at his neighbours from his balcony. And of course, there's a murder. And, by the comings and goings of your neighbours. And with you sort of enlist the help of this young left-wing journalist who's obviously Jorge finds to be repellent in her political views. But with her help, you sort of begin to piece together this mystery. And what a good concept, It's good. It's a first-person game as well, I should say, and you're embodied in Jorge in his wheelchair, and you have free reign to wheel around your flat and the balcony. But then what proceeds is like incredibly linear, and pretty clanky and buggy as well. But if you forgive it that, that's fine. But it's basically ends up being a game where you sort of hunt the interactive hotspots for the narrative to progress, and I mean that's fine. Like, and it tells an interesting story, and the voice acting is actually really good in it. But man, I spent the whole time imagining the game where you're observing sort of like the clockwork events of a block of flats from your rear window, a la Rear Window, and maybe there's some sort of like time loop mechanic or time scrubbing mechanic, so you can replay the same events over and over until you piece together their significance. I really want to play that game, and I really want to play, just take any game where I can pretend to be Jimmy Stewart for a moment. But
I was just thinking, maybe I'm just thinking about this because of a game that literally came out today. But the way you've described it makes it sound like a bit like Hitchcocking Pokemon Snap, which is an incredible idea.
Yes, that's what I want to play. Yeah, in fact, I was thinking of describing it in those terms.
Yeah.
Hitchcocking Panko Park is what I would have gone for. But as I was corrected on a previous podcast, Panko Park is apparently very much like Pokemon Snap. But that's not this, unfortunately. It's this is very much a very linear narrative game where the only thing you can do is follow the narrative.
Snap is basically a rail shooter. Like that's the that's really what it is.
Right. I see what you mean. Yes, but you have agency over what you're snapping.
True.
And you can snap multiple things and observe multiple things, right? At least you can in Panko Park. But I mean, in this, there's really only one thing that you need to look at any one time for stuff to progress. Right. So it feels much more kind of trammeled.
More like a visual novel, really.
Yes, yeah, it is pretty much a visual novel, but it's 3D.
Does it function as a visual novel? Like, because I completely get what you're saying. Like, it sounds like there's amazing games to be made out of like basically Detective Pikachu, Rear Window.
Yes.
But
if there was some kind of systematizing of it, yes.
Yeah, it feels like it could be systematized, I guess. Does it feel like it needs to be? Is there still a compelling visual novel to be made out of that premise? I don't know.
It's hard to say. I mean, it's a little bit clunky and rough around the edges. So that sort of if there was just like an amazingly compelling plot that just pulled you through all the rest of it, and then it wouldn't matter that it was limited in these regards. But I think it's just on that cusp of not being quite finessed enough. It's actually almost just a matter of months of extra development, I think, to really kind of hone it. But also it did break for me, and I couldn't complete it because just an event trigger just wouldn't trigger. So I couldn't get any further with the story. But interesting. I hope somebody makes the game that what did you call it? Hitchcocking
Pokemon Snap.
Pokemon Snap. Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know.
Or Detective Pikachu.
I feel like Pokemon Snap is a genre that you could apply many directorial lenses to, and they'd all be amazing.
Nicholas Winding Refn, Pokemon Snap.
Only Dugtrio forgives.
Did you ever play a game called Private Eye, which it became a VR game, but when I first played it, it was just like a demo before VR headsets were available. But it was basically Rear Window. You're sat in a wheelchair at a window with a virtual reality headset on. You're able to zoom your camera out of the window and look at what's going on in the apartment building opposite you, and it told the story through that.
That sounds like it. Is that it? Is that the game that I'm talking about, basically?
Possibly. I'm not 100% sure I'm not 100% sure what happened with this game. Like, I remember there being a bunch of trailers for it maybe 3 years ago now, but I'm not sure if it was ever finished and actually came out. Because people really liked that initial demo, but it was pretty bare bones. And then I remember them, like, doing a new trailer, like announcing the art style for it and that sort of stuff, and it going through all these levels of polish, but I never actually heard about it being released. So this might be an anecdote that goes nowhere.
Something for the show notes. Yeah. But the second game I wanted to very, very briefly mention is Portal Reloaded, which is a standalone fan mod for Portal 2. And it's really cool. It's finished to a pretty high level of polish for a mod, not quite Valve level, obviously, but it has bespoke VO, and tries to tie its levels together in a sort of portally framing. So it's not just a sequence of levels. There's a robot voice talking to you and stuff, and it has the gimmick of a third portal. Would you believe?
What the fuck?
A time portal. A time portal, which is very exciting. But again, like, just that phrase suggests more than it actually delivers. In that, although the game is clever and the puzzles are good head scratchers, of a sort of like 7 Hazeldens out of 10 sort of rating. It's not actually about time in the way that you might think it is. I mean, instead of you being able to sort of interact with past and future versions of yourself, which is what is sort of suggested by that and other time-related puzzle games that I've played, this actually just sort of bounces you. The time portal just takes you between 2 versions of the same world, one in the inverted commas present and one 20 years in the future. And really what that means is that there are just 2 versions of the level, but there are some extra constraints on the order in which you do things. Some of which are just artificial. For example, you can take a box from the future and back to the past, but you can't take a box from the past to the future, because it says that breaks causality, even though that is literally how time works. Things go from the past to the future.
I'm doing it right now.
Yeah. And also, I mean, even if you thought crossing that boundary was in some way invalidating causality, because the box in the future then wouldn't have the same trajectory as the box that you're taking to the future, you yourself are passing between these realms, so there is obviously some transit allowed. Anyway, there's lots of little things like that. It's more like if I found it was very difficult. The puzzles are difficult anyway, but I found it was very difficult to get my head around whilst I was trying to think of it in the context of time. But when I began to abstract it out just to a series of random rules, it actually became a lot more comprehensible to me. But it's worth your time, and it's free, and if you own Portal 2, and it's cool. And well done, everybody. Well done. Chris, what have you been playing?
Well, I have been playing a few things, but the only thing I have to say about the resurgent Warzone, Call of Duty Warzone, is that I love its trash nonsense, and it has one of my favorite bugs of any game at the moment. Not even bugs, because it's not a bug if the developers obviously left it there. But the whole game has been reset to 1984 for some reason. And the whole map has been changed to make it the past. And there's a new sequence at the beginning where a fleet of helicopters fly in and your team is on one of them, ready to drop into the war zone. And this is like one of the most expensive games I've ever seen. A vast amount of money has been spent making this work. This multi-hundred player battle royale and all of the different things lavished upon it. And literally the first thing that happens at the start of a game is the camera crash zooms through the windscreen of the helicopter to see one of your characters, one of the 2 custom operator skins you and your friend has unlocked. I think thanking the helicopter pilot. I don't know what they're saying. Like, thanks, mate. We're going to go die now or whatever. And you are inexplicably trapped in like some maximum LOD mesh hell that makes you look like Lara Croft from the 90s. And it is the most confident, like, it's one of, like, I do love Warzone. It is hot trash and I adore it. But it is one of the most, like, it's an unavoidable issue. It happens every single time. And it is literally the first thing you see your character do at the start of every round you will ever play. And as such, I think it's honestly one of the most spectacular, like, acts of, like, we can make this engine do a lot, but we can't fix this, acts of kind of like game dev bed shitting that I've seen in a long time. It's like, there's no way they didn't catch this, but there's some deep sunk cost in this tech stack that means we can't fix this. And like, as one character is like tapping the pilot on the shoulder being like, Thank you for flying us to the war zone. The other one is in the background behind them, like tiny shoelaces or something. And then they kind of walk together and the camera moves around them as they get ready to leap into action. And the other one, you can see them in the background snap from like 4 polygons to lots. And then by the time the camera finishes its pan around both of them, they're suddenly like super, in my case, super up-resed kind of like digi people. And there's something about it that I think is genuinely magic, but testament to my experience of that whole game, which is like the most expensive thing in the world that's just holding together by the skin of its teeth any given time. But that's what I want to say about Warzone, and that is basically a segue into talking about the game that I have been playing. And I kind of gestured at this when I was last on the podcast, but I got a new PC at last. I had to wait 4 months, I think, for my graphics card and my CPU to become available. I know Tom Senior is still waiting because that is the reality of buying a new PC at the moment. And that has allowed me over the last couple of weeks to play a much more serious amount of Cyberpunk 2077, a game you may have heard of. I appreciate that you both have played it. I have not finished it yet, so I'm not going to talk about any spoilers for people who might be worried about that. But I did want to revisit it because I've had an interesting experience of it in the last couple of weeks of having a chance to play it after its first patch or first big update or whatever, to the extent that it's a big update. Also after really, I think the fires of that particular discourse have substantially died down. People's attention has moved elsewhere. So maybe a little bit free of the kind of it being everywhere at the time where it's being played. And also on a PC that doesn't break a sweat, running it at the highest kind of settings, which is, I imagine, the kind of PC that it was most consistently tested on. So having something like an optimal experience of it. And I want to talk about it a little bit because I'm finding it really interesting and enjoyable and complicated because, I don't want to embark on this without obviously caveating that with a note on like the kind of the issues that were raised during the course of its development and immediately afterwards about the conditions in which it's produced and the crunch development that goes into that. And in acknowledging that like it's I would say it is a unusually humane story in some ways, but in a setting that is certainly, let's say, selectively progressive, and I can completely understand why people find it off-putting. So with those caveats out of the way, I found it really like a really fascinating kind of artifact. I think I gestured at some of this when I first played the first 6 hours of it, but having dug a bit deeper into it, it's been a really kind of extraordinary and very specific ride to go on, the kind of experience that I've not had with the game for a really, really long time, as a immersive, narrative-driven role-playing game. And what it absolutely isn't is exactly the sort of game it was sold as being, which is a sandbox adventure game or a sandbox role-playing game. It is set in an open world as a backdrop for its adventure, and that open world is really extraordinary in terms of its detail and its sense of place, and I can kind of return to that. But it is not an interactive open world. It's not a simulation in any way, really. And it is at its best when you don't try and even pretend that it is. And I think it is such a misfire, such a colossal misfire of that game's marketing, but even not just marketing, the way it was presented by its own developers consistently, the way its developers still refer to it in the patch notes they put out, where they talk about, improving the police system and things. Like, none of that stuff is relevant to its success at all, or to the work that's gone into it, or the kinds of experiences that it renders. Like, it is a game about this series of really beautifully crafted, immersive narrative experiences set in a world that feels open enough to give you moments where you feel like you're in a real place, but that crucially is really not there for you to poke at the fringes of it, because that's not the reason it's fun. It's not GTA. The game I would compare, I compared it to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines last time, and that kind of era of first-person RPGs, and that still holds. The other game I would compare it to now, having played it, is the first Mafia. which is very much a narrative game first. Yes, it's set in an open world. Yes, GTA was a huge influence. No, it's not the game where you just run out to the street and start mowing down civilians to get the cops to chase you and then go on a kind of dynamic adventure. Because that would break the character of the world that they've established, and therefore the game kind of starts to strain because it's not something the developers not intended you to do, but like I think the first Mafia at least feels to me like it kind of makes a fairly clear statement about where its interests lie, and if you want to push against that, fine, it's an interactive game, you can do that, but it's not the point. And I think the same is true of Cyberpunk. And I don't know if they would ever have been able to dodge the hype and expectation that followed that game, but it strikes me as a real shame that they never set expectations appropriately for what it actually is, because what it actually is very impressive consistently. Like every session I have with the game, every time I sit down and play it, I have at least one wrenching experience of really feeling like I'm in another place and that I have been kind of transported into this city, and it breaks down upon scrutiny because of course it does in that regard, but it's really like evocative and impressive. And the other game it reminds me of very strongly in that particular regard is Sleeping Dogs, which I think is another game that has that uses an open world, and particularly an open world city, to tell you a story, but it really isn't there. I think Sleeping Dogs had stronger fundamentals, but it's also not really there for you to just treat as a playground. And so I wonder with Cyberpunk that it's fighting the wrong battles, trying to become this anything simulator, when actually it's a very specific story about very specific people at a very specific time. And, I don't want to go into too much details of that story, but like I am really struck by both its pretty persistent sense of heart and humanity, like, and this is very much related, I think, to its sense of place, because it's a really strange example of like its sense of place comes as much, I think, from obviously there are moments where you're just walking around and you look up at this kind of incredibly detailed city that looks amazing from almost any angle, and yeah, the occasional NPC will be duplicated or something, or kind of T-pose in the middle of the road, because having a strong PC doesn't stop that happening. But it really is sort of extraordinary, and the audio is amazing and things like that. But also you're grounded in that by the amount of humanity invested in the scenes where you're just kind of doing stuff with another person. There's a lot of sitting at bars and going for drives. And I made a note because I wanted to make notes for this, like how I wanted to talk about it. And the note I've written is, game make me sad about want to go to place. And that is true. That is the emotion that it's made me have a lot. Like last night I was playing through a sequence which was just driving through the desert with somebody, and I happened to have embarked on that mission kind of late at night, and it got me in that particular way. Every session I have something like this, where just the sense of place, the sense of being on an adventure with another person, the way those characters are presented, which is not always like dazzlingly written or performed, but it sets a high bar, I think, for itself. And like those moments are incredibly evocative and effective. And in those moments, I don't want to be able to like combat roll out of the car and go do my own thing. I want to follow its lead and go on the ride that it's laid out for me. The level of detail is really, really extraordinary. And I think that has value. And I think sometimes, and what I would say is it's nobody's fault that particular value was not highly celebrated when the game came out, because it was not what it was advertised to be. And that is on the developers at the end of the day. But there has to be, I think, room for games that use these open settings as a stage to do something more specific, where yes, it's an illusion. Yes, half the dialogue choices you have don't really matter, but that's the play. That's the show that you're participating in. You are steering, not leading this thing as it kind of takes you through this experience. And if you go with it with that benefit of the doubt, I found it really, really effective. I don't believe that all interactive media needs to be maximally interactive. But I also certainly think that if you are going to roll out with a game and claim that it is, a do anything simulation of life in a kind of cyberpunk future world, then that's what you need to offer. And it's not what they made. And like, and then there's all of the kind of orbiting jank. Like I'm having a good time with it because I don't care about the combat system. I don't care about the loot. like I'm wearing the clothes that I care about, and if I'm having trouble, I just find a way around it. And like the strangeness of its systems, where like the guns look and sound amazing, but the combat system doesn't really make them feel great to use. And I'm playing it with a pad, kind of leaning back from my monitor, which is kind of what I would recommend. It benefits from the kind of slow pan approach, I think. Half the skill points you invest feel totally pointless, so that's just kind of busy work that acts as a breather between meetings. Like, none of this stuff is like kind of where it should be. All of it's very much like The Witcher, I think, in terms of like why you're there. Like, the relationship between the systems aren't why you're there, put it that way. But getting through it all, I'm finding it really kind of like very singular, I think, as a game and as a moment in time. And there's a lot of baggage attached to that, but I do feel it's been nice to be able to kind of, I think, celebrate in isolation the work that was done by a lot of people to bring that stuff to life. It sometimes really feels like the case that these very talented teams were given the task of bringing particular moments to life as best they could with the technical restrictions they were given. And I think it's really extraordinary in that regard, the consistency with which it kind of achieves these moments that are genuinely above and beyond, I think, anything I've seen a game do without real smoke and mirrors. In fact, it's awkward halfway house where it refuses to use smoke and mirrors. Like, I was thinking about that drive sequence yesterday, where another game from another era would have stuck me in some kind of looping, parallax scrolled kind of micro world to simulate the world rolling by on the other side of the window. Cyberpunk has taken one big step out of that and decided to actually simulate sort of the world outside the window, which is why the car in front of me hit the curb and then spiraled into space. But I was still very immersed. You know what I mean? And like,
Yeah.
I mean, I know that I have a weakness for folly, but fucking hell, like they really did something. I feel like I can't talk about Cyberpunk without talking about my favorite thing that's gone wrong so far, which is when I got in a gunfight in the street with a very powerful enemy with the promise of cool loot and exciting things to be yielded from their corpse should I kill them. But unfortunately, I shot them to death so hard while they were standing next to a car that their corpse began driving the car. Dead, but very much in the animation and posture of a seated civilian driving a car from which they cannot be looted. And I just had to kind of leave them there that like, well, this, sure. The other thing I wanted to say about it, and I found it a very particularly compelling experience in this, the worst of the three lockdowns, because, like I said earlier, made me sad about wanting to go to place, made me sad about wanting to sit in bar next to a human. There's been moments where like your character takes a big swig of the tequila they've been given, which is a kind of recurring beat, and I'm like, God, I wish I was in an awful bar in like Orange County after BlizzCon. Like, what the fuck? Like I remember watching the new Blade Runner in Vegas and walking out of that film into that place and having the kind of the two things collide with each other in a very kind of kaleidoscopic way, and sort of really missing that pretty horrible place, and sort of and I think that is both a phenomenon that's very current and I think quite powerful about the game that is unique to this particular time, but also indicative of something that I think is really interesting in how it succeeds as a story and fails as sci-fi. And I think a lot of people, there's been a lot of things said about Cyberpunk as science fiction and how that relates to that. And obviously it's a genre very rooted in the 1980s. I think I said that last time I talked about it. But one thing that occurred to me playing it is one of its big successes is that it's fundamentally a story about people and their close relationships with one another. And one of the things that is most that shows the age of its ideas quite so strongly is the way that its notion of what kind of like punk or kind of subculture communities are like is extremely deeply rooted in a very 1980s conception of punk, which is very much as, kind of informal collectives of people and found families that gather in cities that are otherwise kind of far bigger than them, and that are ultimately kind of big avatars of the systems that would otherwise crush them, and that these pockets of kind of like not just resistance but mutual support kind of form in physical space, in physical spaces, in bars and in clubs and around live music and around drinking and around drugs and around like gang level crime and all the other different ways that manifests in Cyberpunk, particularly, which originally as a setting is kind of like a reaction to LA in the late 80s, and projecting that into 2077 is just openly romantic in a way that is like quite touching but feels wholly unrealistic. And I don't think that's a failing. Like, I think it's a fantasy at the end of the day. It's progressed from sci-fi into fantasy along that axis. But like, it's really interesting that like, I think that's one of the reasons that it's had this one of the things that strikes me as kind of interesting about its unlikely collision with the internet and the way the internet is structured is its version of what like anti-establishment community looks like is rooted in a notion of like physical closeness that is alien now for two separate reasons: one, the pandemic, and two, the internet itself. And the simple fact is that those communities aren't reliant on physical proximity anymore, and therefore its entire kind of house of cards comes falling down. There's a moment early on where you're kind of brought back to your apartment after something bad happens by a character who's taking physical care of you, and obviously that absolutely is still a thing in real life, but it struck me as like probably one of the most punk moments that it achieves, but very much rooted in an increasingly bygone era, which is a strange feeling to attach to a game that is set 50 years in the future. The wildest thing that that kind of caused these things to sort of collide together for me in a very strange way is a very minor spoilers, and if you really don't know anything about the game, then maybe skip ahead a little bit. But there are sequences where you flash back to the original setting for Cyberpunk 2020, which kind of describes an alternate future for America, where starting in the 90s, it starts to get very cyberpunk. This is obviously the version of the game that came out in 1987. And that stuff is, I have run that game for PlayStation Access, actually, who I mentioned earlier, and I am fond of it. And so having a flashback to that setting was kind of personally resonant. Not only that, the particular flashback takes place, the date flashes up at the bottom, and it flashes to August the 4th, 2013, which was not only my 26th birthday, it was my birthday I spent in Vegas.
Oh, wow.
So I had this extremely strange thing of like, I know where I was when this was happening. When these awkward, awful neon cyber people were kind of falling over each other and, getting hammered in awful bars, so was I. And that was sort of unusually relevant. Also, because in lockdown, I've grown shoulder-length hair and a beard. Every time Johnny Silverhand looks in the mirror, I have this really strange sense of place that I find hard to... yeah, it's been a strange little ride, but I'm glad I'm doing it. And I think I don't know what the future looks like for that game or that company or that franchise, if it is a franchise or whatever, or how they come back from what they done. But if they can, but I do think it will, particularly as technology advances and the game stabilizes and it becomes more accessible in its best light to more people, I think it will have value as something to return to. I appreciate that's a strange thing to say, to say that I think this game that sold an extraordinary number of copies has a cult future.
No, I think that's
but
true.
I think it probably does.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever going to become the simulation game that they purported it to be. I don't think that's ever going to happen, no matter how much they patch it. I just don't think there are the bones for that in the game.
No,
but I don't think that also matters at all. Like, I mean, at no point when I was playing that was I really jonesing to have like a systemic police interaction or anything of that ilk.
Right.
I was quite happy going from one more or less kind of level essentially to another, and using the open world as a very evocative loading screen. It's interesting to compare that to Mafia and, well, actually more specifically LA Noire, because I think LA Noir's open world, although it was uh, incredibly evoked its sense of place and time, it was also more of an inconvenience than uh, than a benefit. I think, in fact, that game probably would have benefited from you just going from one cutscene to another cutscene, more or less, with some walking around. But I don't think that's the case with Cyberpunk. I mean, regardless of all the mistakes that they made and the insufficiency of its simulated open world, I think that sense of place is enough to be very rewarding to drive around and exist in, and to space out the interactions that you have.
Yeah.
Not including the stupid robot man's constant badgering of you to pick up his fucking cars. That can go to hell.
Right, or the strange incessant insistence that you just ambiently help the police for some reason.
Yeah, right.
The most punk act. You're driving past a crime. Do you want to stop it? No.
It always feels to me like there's a difference between, like, when Cyberpunk came out and people were disappointed by it, and I was reading subreddits for it and stuff like that, people weren't complaining, oh, I can't have a dynamic systemic adventure. And really, if you look at Grand Theft Auto, the only dynamic systemic adventure it seems to offer that anyone can think of is you can shoot the cops and then the cops will come after you, and then you can have like a fight against bigger cops until you die, which isn't very much of a systemic adventure. And afterwards, you just walk out of a hospital and maybe you've lost some money from your bank account. It makes no difference. Like, there are no consequences or any actual meaning to it. What they seem to want is just more of that sense of place that you're talking about, which they get from Grand Theft Auto, because there's lots of mini games essentially that you can do.
Right.
Like there is no greater consequence to going and doing lots of bowling in Grand Theft Auto 4 or lots of tennis in Grand Theft Auto 5. And as mini games, they're not particularly good tennis or bowling games, but they convey some sense of reality upon the world that people really crave from these experiences. Which is why I think actually the game that's done the best perhaps at competing with Grand Theft Auto recently is the Yakuza series, which are made on such a smaller budget. And I mean, they are open world, but they're very small open worlds. But they just have tons of mini games. They have a really believable sense of place because you can walk into the shops and you can order food from that little kiosk, and you can go to that karaoke bar and sing, and you can become a real estate manager for some reason. And like, they're simulating all these different things, but it's simulating in a very push button sort of way where there is no like dynamic adventure that spills forth from it. So when I was looking at subreddit, people were like, I want to go into the arcade and be able to play the arcade machines. That's the stuff they wanted to be able to do. And I can see the bones for that sort of stuff in Cyberpunk. That feels very much like a limitation of budget and time. But, rather than, an engine limitation or a technology limitation, perhaps.
I 100% agree with that. And I think, like, part of me is glad that it is what it is because I'm able to have, like, a focused experience of it and not get lost in that stuff. I don't trust that a modern game developer could add a raft of like playable arcade games, for example, to the game and not attach some achievement or score system or ability or reward to doing them. I think that's this is a bit of a kind of it's good if it's bad and it's good if it's good and it's bad and it's bad kind of take. But like, I have found myself sort of perversely relieved by the fact that what I need to do to progress the game and see more of the things I care about is very straightforward. And I feel like, but otherwise, I actually completely agree with you. I think that is what people are missing, and I think it is the game certainly struggles for the amount. It has an awkward relationship with its own set dressing. I think some of the way that the side missions and things are constructed means that it desperately wants you to see that backdrop as something other than set dressing, but so much of the heart of the game is in the much more structured experience that it's clear what it is, but I don't think that's on players at all to pass the difference. And I think it's quite a generous read, really, of something that just sort of goes halfway into letting you play outside of that particular kind of quite narrow path.
I do. I hope you stick with it and see through it to the end. Because I've talked about it in the podcast before, but I liked it. I thought it was a good game. I mean, it's not the best game, and it's not the game it was sold to be. But I think it's a good game, and I would much rather play Cyberpunk 2077's fundamentally quite hopeful view of humanity and the goodness of people, even when they're in an unfeeling system, versus Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto cynical, every single person is a horrible asshole.
Yeah.
Don't go do jobs for them now. I'm exhausted of that style of storytelling, and I'm pretty sure GTA 6 probably be just the same. Whereas I would be quite eager to play a Cyberpunk follow-up should one ever appear.
Right. Yeah, totally. And I think that's probably the best option, really. Like, quietly make a sequel, Mass Effect 2 this thing, I guess, if they get given that option. I do want to caveat all of what I've just said by, like, maybe I just really want to go to a bar.
I'd settle for a cheesecake factory in Anaheim, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. I want to be ushered into a cheesecake factory by a PR and have a conversation about the business with the person sat next to me. I don't want that, but I would definitely do the option where you look at your drink and press X, and then you just drink instead of picking any of the other conversation options. That's always available.
Sit outside the Saddle Ranch on the Sunset Strip and have a really awkward conversation with a woman who's had lots of plastic surgery about how she makes all her models immediately lose 10 pounds when she hires them.
Fucking hell.
Oh, God.
How many of Cyberpunk's problems are just problems with LA?
I think the problems exist elsewhere, but it's a very LA game. It's LA as fuck.
Yeah.
Shall we do questions from questions?
Yes, we should.
Marsh.
Thank you.
I would like to request 3 or 4 questions that make me feel old.
Excellent. Well, your wish will be granted. The first is not a question. It does have a question in it, but it's not really a question. It's more of a rhetorical question.
Okay.
Anyway, it's from Mads. It says, Dear Crane Crowbar, in episode 366, that was the last episode, you wondered if the third man might feature the first sewer level to outstay its welcome in Western fiction. I don't have a question. I just thought I would tell you that sadly, it's not. About 3/4 into Les Miserables, the young Marius flees the law by entering the sewers of Paris. The story is reaching a heart-pounding climax when Victor Hugo breaks off the action to give the reader 30-odd pages worth of backstory for the sewer itself. The intestines of the Leviathan. I'm guessing that the editors couldn't tell him no at this point in his career. Thanks for the pods, Mads. That's a good note. Thank you.
That is an amazing note. Wasn't Les Mis released episodically like a fucking nerd? It was serialized, right?
I don't know. Was it?
I'm pretty sure it was. I think I may be wrong about this, and someone will tell me. But there is an interesting amount. Like, I love detecting the places that padding arrives in serialized fiction that are now kind of consumed as novels or in other formats. And the fact that Les Mis has a blight town, delicious. Real cross-section of my interests. So thank you.
Tom writes in to say, Dear CNC, Bioshock came out 14 years ago. While you mentally adjust to that fact, consider that the 14-year time frame also separates the release of Bioshock from the original Doom.
Shit.
So, video games, is that it? I jest, of course, but when was the last time a game genuinely impressed you with its use of technology, VR notwithstanding? Cheers, Tom. P.S. Another fun time tidbit. COD 4 Modern Warfare also came out in 2007, which means OG Doom is to COD 4 Modern Warfare as COD 4 Modern Warfare is to this year's upcoming COD Vanguard.
Well, in answer to his question, I mean, it's an easy one for me because that's literally a thought that I had while playing Yedoma Globula. It's not often these days that I'm impressed by the technology underpinning something, but an infinitely sized fractal world that's dynamically lit and physics interacts with it, and it's rendered with cone marching, as we discussed earlier. I was impressed. Hierarchical cone marching, to specify the type. It's important.
Ken Levine never marched a cone, did he?
But he could if he wanted to.
I feel like I always feel guilty when we're doing a podcast and the answer to the question is the game I was just talking about. But like half of what I was talking about with Cyberpunk is how impressive its presentation, its technology is. And it's just not stuff that would have been possible 5-10 years ago. Like in terms of the level of fidelity. Even when someone T-poses their way into space, it is a genuinely technologically impressive experience. I agree that those things are rarer, but I think I would put it a different way. I think the impressive uses of technology in modern games are felt in ways that aren't simply more immersive first person experiences. Cyberpunk is the one that I would call to as part of that lineage, but that was pretty much the only measure by which sort of technology was judged. Like, and it still is, the measure for any new kind of gaming technology is, can this make me live in a sci-fi world, please, forever, actually, but in my brain, is it a holodeck? And the answer is almost always no, but really amazing technology is being developed all the time for, like, content creation tools and proc gen and AI and all of these things that we couldn't do anywhere close to the same level of fidelity a couple of years ago. So I do think things march on. They just march on in more diverse ways.
I mean, NVIDIA RTX voice is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
You don't know this, but like Chris has just been playing a trumpet in the background during this entire conversation, but we can't hear it.
Yeah, exactly. How about this? You hear that? I just threw a piece of blue tack at a Coke can. And you didn't hear it. Incredible. Also, audio gold. You can dynamically remove Foley artists from existence with NVIDIA RTX voice. It will only capture their grunts of frustration. And if that isn't progress, I don't know what is.
I think Teardown is a very impressive game recently. But actually, I mean,
exactly.
I think it's not so much that I'm being wowed and bowled over by big tentpole releases, but so much as I'm being wowed at a much more continual, lower level by lots and lots of games.
I'm sorry. Tentpole caught me off guard. I'm just going to be honest. It was the notion of a single spectacular tentpole versus a more sustained experience is, if nothing else, a laudable way to march into your mid to late 30s. Like, it's
a tantric wow.
you taste, your palate is more refined.
Did you see Teardown's smoke?
Oh yeah, they're improving it.
I'm not sure if it's deployed and in the game, but he's been posting GIFs of it, smoke, which dynamically billows around buildings as you destroy them. So if you smash a hole in the side of the wall, the smoke will start spewing out of that hole. It looks amazing.
That's hot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I would also point to things like, I don't know, like really enjoying the technology behind things like totally accurate battle simulator. Yeah. Like just this kind of sort of daft mix of physics and kind of procedural animation and things purely for fun in a way that I don't think necessarily needs to be turned to an immersive purpose, to kind of just be a testament to why it's cool to give that much more powerful technology to every person making games rather than just
I mean the democratization of these technologies is impressive in itself. I think
I'm quite upset I've lost my blue tack. For the sake of a bit, I didn't. And the stupid thing is, I didn't even need to actually do it because the RTX voice was going to make it inaudible anyway. but I need you to know that I did, and I was playing with that blue tack, and it's gone now.
How time makes a mockery of us all. Sam from LA writes, could you explain something to me? I'm a big Elder Scrolls fan, about 2,000 hours played. It seems that if I was a big corporation and had a valuable intellectual property like that, I would ride it for all that it's worth. Instead, Bethesda seems determined to consign it to the dustbin of history by not creating Elder Scrolls 6 in a timely manner. I mean, it will be a minimum of a decade between Elder Scrolls 5 and Elder Scrolls 6. Can you explain the logic of this from a purely from a business standpoint? Perhaps it's the cost of a modern engine, or perhaps feeling that the days of online gaming are behind us. Baseless speculation will be gratefully received. Thanks, Sam from LA.
Shit takes a really long time. Just does. I think, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, it calls it out in the question, but like any speculation is baseless because, and I'm always a little bit, I always gets my back up a little bit when people kind of point to kind of more conspiratorial feelings to assume why the game they want hasn't come out yet. And really often the case is hard to make game, hard to make big game, hard to make game where you see you go. Difficult. Take long time. Probably take more high fidelity world is. Over time, expectation go up.
Bethesda, at least this used to be the case. Maybe Graham knows more than I do, but it used to be the case that the team that focused on Elder Scrolls was very small for a game of that size. I don't think it was much more than like 100 people, and they made a decision as a company that was the size that they wanted to be, and that was the culture that they had a culture which was best fitted to that particular size, and they didn't want to massively expand, and they would take the hits with regard to development in order to maintain their studio culture. I think that's a perfectly acceptable decision to make.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of decision that people struggle to understand. Like, I don't know what Bethesda are doing these days in terms of like, maybe they're outsourcing all their asset creation to other companies or something like that, so they can still produce things in high fidelity and all this sort of stuff. But when you say to someone, well, they're a pretty small team and there are good cultural reasons to maintain that for a team which is producing successful stuff, they don't necessarily understand why a game what is as successful as Skyrim, they've got lots of money, why don't they just go hire 400 new people and have them make the new Elder Scrolls game? There are like a ton of problems and lots of ways in which that will destroy a company a lot of the time, that kind of scale. But a lot of people don't understand that. They don't think about that.
The other side of it, there's many sides to this. The other side of it is, I would say that a new Elder Scrolls game, far from being something that's like, oh, it's being superseded by hot new trends like internet games. It's more the case that it's probably, of all things, a relatively safe bet. Whenever it comes out, its only meaningful competition is itself, as in Skyrim, like, and maybe you can point to The Witcher at some point in time, but like Cyberpunk, there aren't a ton of these things being made, and that means that I doubt they feel tremendous pressure to release it. And because they're certainly not trying to race to get out ahead of the other great open world fantasy role playing game being made. The other side of it is, they Fallout 4, for example, had a relatively rapid path from announcement to release. That kind of thing could happen again. But also, Bethesda have a lot of lived experience of being thought of as the company that releases kind of some fairly busted stuff. And it wouldn't surprise me if this is wholly speculative and wholly just sort of putting myself in their shoes. But if you've got a game that's pretty much guaranteed to be successful, at the very least doesn't have any pressing window of time where it must be released in order to achieve your goals for it, and you've got a bit of a reputation for releasing games too soon, maybe you don't put pressure to get that game out the door faster than it needs to be, right? That's the one where you play for the big win rather than try and meet some kind of sense of urgency that maybe doesn't actually exist. Because the flip of this is there's a parallel universe where they decided that they were onto a winner and they needed to churn out a new Elder Scrolls game every 2 years, and we are bordering on Elder Scrolls 9 or 10 at the moment, and you hate them now. And, you know, you ultimately kind of... I would have faith, basically. Like, you know, maybe it'll be shit, but there is really no way to know, and I don't think there's anything you can ascribe the delay to that's any more nefarious than this stuff takes a long time to make, and there's no real pressure on them to do it anything other than whatever pace makes sense to them.
Are you looking forward to Starfield? Because that's what they said they're working on now.
What is it?
On sci-fi space Skyrim.
What does that mean?
I don't know. Are you interested in a sci-fi game from the team that made Skyrim?
I mean, eh?
When there's more than like 2 nouns to describe it, then I think we can make a judgment.
Yeah. Show me a picture of a spaceship, Todd, and we'll talk.
Hello, fellow nerds, writes Stevie Chunder. I was thinking about the explosion in releases of excellent quality indie games a few years ago, and how it was something of a golden age for this. Lots of stuff, in retrospect, has a definite golden age when it exploded into popularity, creativity, and quality. I was thinking how Jungle and Hip Hop had their golden age in '94, or Warhammer had its golden age in around 1990, for example. Contentious.
Don't start.
Do you think we're living through, or have just lived through, the golden age of computer games? Why? If not, what was the golden age and why? P.S. When are you getting Owen on the podcast? He was great on the old PC Gamer one. Cheers, Stevie Chunder.
We'll admire the commitment to the bit that has this question not only, I think, a little spuriously identify golden ages in like 3 different things, but then identify golden age in this podcast. How dare you? No, I mean, man, I feel like, has anyone ever successfully identified a golden age as it was happening, or is it exclusively the preserve of rose-tinted glasses?
I think, you remember that year when Halo 3 and Super Mario Galaxy came out?
Yeah.
Everybody said, this is the golden age of gaming, and I think they were right. I don't think it, well, I think for those kind of big budget games, it was a golden age, and I don't think that has returned. But I think it's been replaced by something which one might cherish in a different but equal way.
Right. I think this is the thing. I feel like we struggle to deal with the fucking concept of time and change half the time, and that, you know, the qualities by which things were judged when we were forming our tastes are quite specific, and therefore we kind of identified our particular, you know, our optimal kind of alignment between our tastes and the media we consume at a particular point in time fairly naturally. But this is wholly subjective and specific to the individual, or at the very least the group, and therefore is of kind of not really very much critical value, because I guarantee you right now there are right now there are people heralding, you know, or people lamenting the golden age of Vine, just as there are people in 5 years from now who are going to be lamenting the golden age of Snapchat. Like, I think when you refer to golden age of anything, you're just saying I liked things from this particular time, and that's fine, but I don't think it denigrates the stuff that comes after it at all in any way, like even a bit.
Well, I think there is, I mean, just as to clarify what I was saying there, I do think there is a difference between the kinds of games that we had then and now. So that golden age I was referring to is a period in which there were no indie games of which to speak, really, but you did instead have a calendar dominated by big event games, famous games with global name recognition. And that year had like the maximum number of games of the maximum level of event, you know, quality. That doesn't happen anymore. So you could say for that particular kind of game that was a golden age, but for gaming more generally, now we have a plurality of games and much greater diversity of the kinds of games that we experience, and just fucking tons more of them. And individually, they may not be, you know, as big a name as Halo and Mario and so forth. But I don't think we've lost anything by moving to a different style.
Yeah, I think that is fair, and I think maybe to dial back the vehemence that I walked into that with, I think it's the case that the more specific the golden age that you're identifying, the more likely it is to be of kind of objective value. I think that probably applies to musical genres. You could say that point in the kind of mid to late noughties probably was the golden age of, like, as you say, like tentpole blockbuster. There's that word again. Games. And that's useful definition. Do I think, but similarly, do I think that the last couple of years represents the golden age of indie? Fuck no, because obviously that's not going anywhere. Like, it definitely is like a period in time where that stuff became more prominent. Do I think there's never going to be a better game released out of an independent developer than Spelunky or the things that were coming out a couple of years ago? Absolutely not, because that is continually proved to be an incorrect assumption. And so, that then becomes a definition that is not useful for the purpose of identifying, like, particularly, high peak on the sine wave. Similarly, like, I didn't want to take the bait. I'm not going to take the bait, but that's why that definition of, like, was that the golden age for Warhammer, just strikes me as really false, because that's something with a long life and many different eras of creative development and many new people and new voices present in it, and therefore pinning its golden age to any specific thing, which would be the same as if you were talking about the golden age of Star Trek or Star Wars or any big kind of franchise. All it does is speak to personal taste and maybe a preference for era, but it can't speak to the overall quality of the whole thing. So yeah, I think I kind of bristle at the sort of this, because I think it trends towards the belief that things can only get worse as they get different. And I just think that's obviously so resolutely not the case, particularly in a medium as adaptable as this one.
Do you have any feelings, Graham?
I think, oftentimes when people identify a golden age in a medium, it's an era when there were... I don't know if I have anything interesting to say now. It's an era when there was, like, 5 amazing things. Because you get this in television, for example. Like, people in around 2005 were talking about it being a golden age of television because network television had a lot of money and they were investing a lot of money in particular shows, and you had really worthy stuff coming out of HBO. So you had, like, The Wire and The Sopranos on the air at the same time as network TV was pumping huge budgets into stuff like Lost, for example, which was unprecedented, in television at the time. Lost obviously went to shit, but it was, big thing lots of people were talking about. But then it's, as you say, you get the plurality of stuff that comes after that. And that feels to me like the equivalent of what we've had in video games. I think you mentioned Super Mario Galaxy. That was 14 years ago as well. That came out in 2007, the same year as Bioshock and Modern Warfare. But it feels like those big, that word again, tentpole games and tentpole TV shows, they create demand that then expands the market, that you then get a world with a lot more stuff in it. And I would rather live in a world of 200 8 out of 10s than a world of 5 10 out of 10s, basically. And I don't feel like that world that follows after the supposed golden age, the silver age, if you will, is worse. I feel like that's actually better. We just have a warped sense of value around media, I think.
And I think we're all fighting entropy in our own way, including right now. And I'm doing it now. And I get the desire to kind of locate, to kind of plant your flag really firmly, to erect your tent exclusively in a particular area of the medium alike, but it feels like you lose so much, particularly in a medium like this one, particularly. I feel like, to the question earlier about technology, like, there are so many different ways in which games kind of do things now that I couldn't imagine them having been doing even 14 years ago in the golden summer of renting things to your Xbox 360.
It does also have, like, you got to think about your own privilege, because this does tie into representation. If you're talking about a
Yep.
golden age 10, 15 years ago, it was, it was a time when there were a lot of video games and a lot of television shows about white men and white men's problems, and we're all white men.
Yeah.
If you're not a
100%.
white man, you're probably thinking, no, I like the current moment where there's at least a handful more video games and television shows that don't star a gruff McMahon wearing a BMX helmet.
Yeah. Precise. Yeah. Exactly.
Those are all the questions we had this week. If you'd like to send us a question, you can do so at questions@crateandcrowbar.com. You can tweet us at Crate and Crowbar on the Twitters. You can also find all of these recordings as videos on YouTube, where you can find other stuff by us. The address for that is youtube.com/crateandcrowbar. And thanks, as always, to our backers on Patreon. You can back us too at patreon.com/crateandcrowbar, or you can simply join our lovely Discord community, the link for which is on our website, which is crateandcrowbar.com. That's it. I've been Marsh Davis.
I've been Chris Thurston. Why did I fuck that up?
And I've been Graham Smith.
Thanks for listening,
everybody. There might not be burps. There might be something else. I don't like
Audio gold.